Good morning. Uh, we are ready to move forward in our study of Solomon. This would be First Kings, chapter 8. I'm going to share, but looking at me, we're going to share the slide deck, something far more interesting. And welcome to the class this morning. We are looking at Melech Aleph, that is chapter 8. And the rich and amazing story of Solomon. We're going to spend some time in the slide deck. Again, just as review, the United Kingdom of Israel, is in a very strategic time, both in space and time, controlling all the trade routes, the North Euphrates, Tigris and Euphrates, from the great China, ancient China, or called Silk Road, where you have tremendous products of silk, spices from India and China, metals, and then the great migration up from what will become Ethiopia and Yemen. And so the great aromatic resins for incense. And so because of the great ports of Tyre and Sidon, Ashkelon, you have a maritime power that Solomon institutes. We'll talk about that. Again, the city of Zion, or David. Zion is a small hill, once the Jebusite stronghold. David conquers it and builds his base of his early kingdom, fortifies it, and then acquires Mount Moriah with the threshing floor of Aharuna, and there the temple will be built, not by David, by Solomon. And so really this is the story in this chapter of Solomon completing that tremendous task. Another great architectural rendering. If you're looking almost straight north, slightly, north by northeast a little bit, you would see the fingerlet of the citadel of the stronghold of Zion, David's city, and then on to the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah. Again, these are just hills, some valleys. The Kidron Valley over here would be the Mount of Olives through here. There's been much speculation on what the temple actually looked like. At a particular point, it was 52 feet high, so that's a 5-story building, a modern 5-story building. So whether it was this tall or not, it was impressive. It was truly one of the wonders of the ancient world at that time that Solomon had built. And by the way, I'm going to get this to the next slide. Again, another view. The reason I like this slide is we can begin to see this fortified wall that Solomon had built, and that in fact, through archaeological excavations the last 20-25 years, has been found at different locations. And this is stunning archaeological work, absolutely confirming the sophistication, the wealth, the capability of a 10th century BCE kingdom. And of course, we know that as the Solomonic kingdom, starting with David and then on to his son Solomon. This particular gate and wall architecture will also be seen at the dig sites as they begin to excavate Hatzor and Megiddo, and then down to Beersheba, and consistent. And so talk about beyond a trifecta, talk about finding 4 locations where you see this constant architecture, and that confirms what we read in the narrative. Very, very encouraging. Again, we can speculate, but it must have been an incredibly impressive temple. If you ever travel to Egypt, you go to the temple at Karnak, at Luxor, you will see some of the same rectangular approaches, the great Assyrian temple at Nineveh, some of the temples that have been excavated at Ashur and Nippur, Uruk, Ur even, are taking on some of this basic rectangular approach. The Acropolis in Athens, basically a rectangular pillar-held approach. And so this was known throughout the ancients that this was a demarcation of a holy site. And Solomon follows that prescription, but it's a very unique temple, unlike any other temple in the Near East. If you would say maybe 500 years before or 500 years after, it was truly designed by God. And so again, we hear from the description that there is a tremendous amount of inlaid gold on top of beautiful cedar planks. You have a holy area where every day incense is burned. The menorah candle constantly burns. Fresh bread of the presence, or the showbread, is brought in. Must have been an amazing, rich smell if you just walked into the holies. You'd have the incense. You would have this fresh bread constantly being brought in. And then, of course, a curtain divide. And within the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, protected by these massive representations of the Kruvim, translated as cherubim, and then cherub. And then I always laugh with the Baroque vision of a chubby little infant cherub, which had nothing to do with scripturally a Kruvim, but so goes a translation from one culture and language to another. The Kruvim were ferocious, mighty, high order angelic powers, 4 wings. You can always tell the power or rank of the angelic order, because the highest order, the Shafim, or the fiery ones, have 6 wings. The Kruvim have 4. In Ezekiel's vision at the Kedar River, he sees the great Kruvim supporting, and somehow they're the transport system, if you will, of the presence of the glory of God in his vision. And so the Kruvim, always associated with protecting in this dimension, in this world, the presence of God's glory. And of course, certainly at the temple, protecting the seat of mercy above the ark, and the Kruvim symbolically protecting it. And as mentioned, you can kind of see both an elevation and plan that the Solomonic temple was laid out very well, a very strong vestibule, a holy place where you could see perhaps the priest bringing in the showbread, making sure the menorah candle is lit, incense constantly burning, going through the prayers and supplications. On the outside comes the altar and the sacrifices, and then the step up to the Holy of Holies. And it was very wise. God had tremendous numbers of storehouses where votive or free will offerings could be given to God at the temple. And so this is where David would invest gold and silver and materials. They're constantly talking about these shields of gold and bronze and silver, and this would be placed in these storehouses. I think also all the precious incense, all the tremendously precious material placed in these ample storerooms all around the temple, dedicated from an accounting practice, absolutely quantified, known to come in and be taken care of. And it's multi-storied. And so you have multiple levels of these storehouses to take care of and to preserve the temple. You also have these massive columns at the front, clearly one of God's features that he wanted to represent his temple. And then finally, here is the best representation that I've seen. There's many ideas about how the Ark of the Covenant perhaps looked, the powerful Kruvim right at the mercy seat, and then the literal presence of God, the Kubar, there at the judgment seat, at the seat of mercy, as it's also called, within the Holy of Holies. And that must have been an awe-inspiring event once a year at Yom Kippur for the high priest to come in and offer up the sanctification of Israel, the asking of the forgiveness or expiation of the sin. And that's an amazing thing. Let's stop here and have perhaps some thoughts and discussions again on God's temple, its design, anything that hits you, a holy of holies, the way that there is, unlike any other temple. I'll make this very clear. There is no image of a god. If you were to go into Luxor, if you were going to Thebes, if you were going to Delphi, Ashur, go into Nishman, all of these places, ultimately, certainly in Babylon too, you would see a little statue of Marduk or Inlo, or you would see a statue of Shamash or Ashtoreth, but not in God's temple. Now let's stop and let you guys have some discussion. Okay, moving forward, I love to always show this beautiful picture of the current Jerusalem. And here is the Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed to literally sit on the location where the former temple was, the second temple, and then the Western Wall, where Jewish access allows prayers and petitions to go on. There's an incredible tunnel system underneath, and there is a particular place in one of the tunnels where you can get as close to the Temple Mount as possible. And you will see at times Israelis, other Jewish people praying right at that site. When we were there several years ago, there was a group celebrating and praying at that particular site, and they knew with the tunnel system that they were as close to the Temple Mount as they could reach. And so, by all means, travel to Israel, see the beauty of Eretz Israel, and enjoy everything that God has allowed to be preserved. It's a beautiful land, and again, quite an experience. And I want to stop here. And again, this is amazing archaeological progress that's occurred in the last 25 years. The finding of that 10th century BCE gate and wall system around the Temple Mount, consistent with the built up or fortified cities of Hatzor, Megiddo, and Beersheba that we will read about in the coming chapters that Solomon built up. And it's very encouraging to see this great archaeological effort and the preciseness, the carefulness to ascertain not just the rock structure, not just the stratum, but pottery and other material evidence that said this is during the time of Solomon. And so when you read in our narrative that there was a great king with a great wealth, and then you see the hard evidence in the ground coming up, there's only one conclusion: that our narratives, our scriptures are true and reasonable and accurate, and we're getting God's divine will for our lives. And again, there's a whole story in this beautiful archaeologist, this wonderful woman who just knew it was there, Elat Matsor, and she knew it was there, and she, against all odds, doggedly determined that she would be given permits to dig, and when she did, she found it. And all of the world rejoices with her efforts. And I believe God, he raises up at such a time people of great talent to do great things, to prove out his word. And so a little bit of transition here. We're gonna talk about it in the narrative. That's very interesting. In our chapter 8, it says, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up, taken Gezer, burned it to the ground, and killed the Canaanites living in that city. Then he had given it as a dowry for his daughter, Sholomon's wife. So Sholomon rebuilt Gezer, and we have found again, I say we, the wonderful dedicated core at the Israeli Antiquities Department has found Gezer, again, built up with the same type of stone that we see at the Temple Mount wall that the archaeologists have dug up, the same type of stone and architecture at Megiddo, at Hatzor, and at Beersheba, these fortified cities. And so after a while you go, okay, this is true. We see it in the digs. We see it in the excavations. And here again is an architect's rendering of what Gezer, as another fortified city, looked like after Solomon built it back up with the same architecture that he was using throughout the land. This is very important to just absorb and think about. And then also, he also built up Lower Beit Horon, Baalat, Tadmor, in the desert and the land, as well as all the cities that Solomon had for storing supplies, the cities for his chariots, the cities for his horsemen, and the other buildings. Solomon wanted to build for himself in Jerusalem and the Levant, that's Lebanon, and throughout the land that he ruled. And we keep finding, dig after dig, these very specific locations that are mentioned in the scripture. And that is just I think it's a very comforting thing. It's very intriguing. And, we should be praying literally for the Israeli Antiquities Department. I think they now have 2,735 active dig sites, and they keep finding amazing material week after week, year after year, on and on and on. And then I want to introduce a concept that we'll pick up from the narrative, that because Solomon's empire, again, touching the Euphrates and the Tigris all the way down to, touches the Red Sea, Itzan, Geder, and of course Tyre, Sidon, Ashkelon, all of the Jaffa, all of these wonderful ports, he became an international trade empire. And there are two areas that will be mentioned. The first one in chapter 8 about Fair, later Tarshish or Tartessa, both very important locations for the import of spices, unguents, incense, silver, gold, you name it. But look at the, that's literally going from southern Spain all the way to the tip of modern Yemen, and all trade routes in between. And we know historically, by the time of the 10th century, that the Aegean had revived. This is the time when Homer will start to write the Iliad and the Odyssey. Greece, the Greco area, will start to revive. They will have colonies all through Sicily, southern Italy. The great movement of the Carthaginian Empire will start to emerge in Tunis, at Carthage. And so there is this rich heritage coming out of Tyre, especially, of a trading empire. And Solomon really helped set that up, and his partnership with King Hiram of Tyre sets up Israel to be an international trade hub. Wonderful, again, silks and materials and spices coming from China and India. Again, coming up from Yemen and Ethiopia, beautiful wood and unguents and incense material, frankincense and myrrh and so many other things. From Tarshish, amazing amounts of silver and other precious materials, all coming in on this amazing trade route. I'm going to stop right there, and let's have a discussion perhaps on why would God let, starting with Solomon, this tiny little tribal people who had been in the desert, slowly conquered the highlands, quite frankly, were the hillbillies of the day for a long time, and now they're literally at the pinnacle of international power. Why would God allow that to happen? I can kind of supply the why at this time, because of the weakness. The Hittite Empire has fallen, Egypt is weak, Greece is just coming out of a dark age. Nothing's happening in the Near East. The Great Assyrian Empire will not come around again, or Babylonian, for hundreds of years. I can supply the why, but I mean, time wise. Well, why do you think God allowed this vast amount of wealth to occur in Israel, these international connections? And I'm going to pause and let you guys have some discussion on that. Very, very exciting and very intriguing as we look at what the scriptures are telling us. And to close out the slide deck, we know the type of ship, the classic, what's called Phoenician galley. It had a square rigger with oars, so whether you had the ability to have wind or not, you could keep moving. Was able to hold, because of its large berth, a tremendous amount of supplies. And there is rich marine archaeology that has found many of these, and they're large for their day, transport vessels. Rich trade going on throughout that whole area. And here is Tartessus, and we see again very strong affinity of that people in those cities in southern Spain, clearly attached to Tyre and Sidon, and this is the same worship of the Tyrrhenian god and goddesses, and so culturally they're tied to that great what's called Tyric trade empire that would go out. They would form the mighty power of Carthage later, and it would be a Phoenician culture and language. The Greeks would literally pick up the alphabet from the Phoenicians, keep their own Greek words and meanings, but they would use the Phoenicians. Why? Because they're trading with them so intensely. And here are the archaeological dig sites at Tartessus. Later, much later, Carthage, through the what's called the Barcid line of the Carthaginian families, the great warrior Hannibal would emerge and cause such trouble for Rome in the Second Punic War. And so this is very rich history. But by the time you start to read the book of Jonah, and Jonah says, you know what, I think I'm going to take the ship to Tarshish, we know where it is. It's Spain. It's as far away as you can get from going the other direction, east to Nineveh. And so that closes out the slide deck. And we want to move over to the narrative. Rich things in the narrative we want to pick up and have a good class. So let's jump in. 1 Kings chapter 8. After Solomon had finished building the house of Adonai, the royal palace, and everything else he wanted to build for himself, Adonai appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him in Givon. That was at the very beginning of his reign. Adonai said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea that you made before me. I am consecrating this house which you built and placing my name there forever. My eyes and heart will always be there. Okay. My eyes and my heart will always be there. Guys, you know, when you read the scriptures, you either say, and this is very dangerous in my opinion, you either say, that's exactly what God means, it's an eternal promise, or we'll try to whittle on that for our own, I don't know, insecurities or I don't know, strange motivations. And, you know, I have people say, well, you know, what's such a big deal about Yerushalayim? Well, right here in the scriptures, you read, my eyes and heart will always be there. Doesn't mean that God's glory will be limited only to Yerushalayim, as we know it's not, but his eyes and heart are on the land, Eretz Israel, I believe, as promised, forever, as long as this world is here. And so I do believe it is a special thing, if you can, to get to Israel and see these places. Why? My name will be there forever. My eyes and heart will always be there. And I'm not saying that this is the way it is. I'm just saying you got to read the scriptures and not let it fly over your head and say, oh, we're way beyond that, and that's the old days, and we're the new, and all this other stuff. You got to be very careful, in my opinion, with that. As for you, if you will live in my presence, as did David your father, in pureness of heart and uprightness. Okay, whoa, 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 whoa. If you will live like your father David, okay, how did David live? Well, there's moments of amazing faithfulness and goodness, but there's also a lot of outrageous sin. And yet, in God's eyes, David, and here it comes, pureness of heart and uprightness, doing everything I have ordered you to do. And so you can see that this is how grace works with God. Wait a minute, Adonai, David was a mess. Oh, yes, I know that, but in my eyes, he is now and has and is pure and upright. But he was an adulterer and a murderer, and he made stupid mistakes, and he let his sons and family go crazy. Yes, yeah. Yet he is of pureness of heart and upright, righteous before me. That is grace. And the only way that you really, I believe, understand grace in the New Testament is you've got to have this rich understanding in the Old Testament of how God sees grace. And so, right here is such an important scripture for us, I believe, in understanding grace. David was a mess, and yet in God's eyes, he is righteous and pure. But if you turn away from following me, you and your children, and do not observe my mitzvahs, regulations which I have set before you, and go and serve other gods, worshiping them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I have given them. This house which I consecrated for my name, I will eject from my sight. Now that gets interesting. I will eject from my sight, even though I just said forever my eyes and my heart will be there. And so you've got to say, well, now what is really being said here? I will eject from my sight, and Israel will become an example to avoid and an object of scorn among all the peoples. Now, if you read that wrong, you go, oh, well, no, wait a minute. There's an inconsistency right here in one paragraph. God is saying one thing, but he's saying another. No, 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 no. He's saying my heart and eyes will always be on that land. It's my sight towards you, Israel, not the land, people. And if you go off and muck up big time, I can no longer watch you doing such evil. And I will look another way, because I will not overpower your free will, but I cannot observe. I refuse to look at the evil that you're involved in. It has nothing to do with the land. It's completely consistent. It has everything to do with your behavior, Israel, not the land. And we don't have within one paragraph a horrible inconsistency. You have to read the scriptures correctly, with discernment that comes from God. This house now so exalted, everyone passing by will gasp in shock, to avoid an object of scorn among all the peoples. That's how bad it'll get. This house now so exalted. But the answer will be, it is because they have abandoned Adonai their God, who brought their ancestors out of the land of Egypt, and took hold of other gods, and worshiping and serving them. This is why Adonai brought all these calamities on them. And so he's warning, if you go down the wrong path, this beautiful temple will actually be a living indictment of your sin. And even the other peoples, the Moabites, the Egyptians, the Phoenicians, will go, wow, what happened here? This is not the way it should be. And the answer will be because Israel abandoned Adonai, and it will become a living testament. I want to stop with chapter 8. I want to jump right into Colette 2. But before I do, please stop and let's let there be a discussion on this whole idea of grace that we see defined by God right here in his attitude towards David, and the consequences of losing your heart towards God and going after something else, and God's warning about that. So do take a break and have a discussion. I'm going to clear my throat here. Okay, we're back. I want us to take a look And we'll do this with Solomon. We're going to take a couple of side journeys, and this is in Colette or Ecclesiastes chapter 2. We're going to look at the great wisdom that God gave him. And so let's read along and have a little discussion about this. In Colette 2, Ecclesiastes 2, I undertook great projects, which we just read about, temple and palace, building up these other cities. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. He was quite the scientist. He knew agriculture, horticulture. I brought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem or Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself, and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers, and a harem. Definitely, he had many wives and concubines, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. And all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet I was surveyed. Yet when I surveyed, in other words, I reflected on all this effort, time, and energy my hands had done, and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. A little bit of logic there, but he's driving to a point. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in darkness. That's an interesting way to describe foolish behavior. It's like being blind. Just as light is better than darkness. Okay, I read that. But I began to realize the same fate overtakes them both. I hate all the things I had toiled for under the sun because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. Cutting into the chapter a little bit there. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it. This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days, their work is grief and pain. Even at night, their minds do not rest. I'm sure all of us can relate to that. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil, their work. This too, I see, is from the hand of God, or without him, who can eat or find any enjoyment? God created us to work hard, to take satisfaction in what we do, to enjoy the fruits of that, and find a level of satisfaction in this life. To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the fool, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. And that is such an indictment. So really, this 3,000 years of tremendous wisdom, and we see this in the wisdom writing of Amenhotep, and we see this in the wisdom writing of Pushnatep coming out of Sumeria, and some of the similar good wisdom. It's all from God, and he chose Solomon to really codify it. And it comes down to this. God may bless you, God may not bless you. If God blesses you, whatever you do, no matter what you do, find pleasure in the moment, day by day. Eating is a daily thing. Your work is a daily thing. So that tells you right now, satisfaction comes from the daily, not always trying to live in the future, certainly not in the past, but in the present. Live in the present daily. And then be very circumspect that, hey, this was great, but this is not what life's all about. I take pleasure in the moments with friends and family, the relationship with God, prayer, the great spiritual experiences I have. That's what matters. The fool runs around trying to gather everything, is an anxiety every day, only then to die. And then what has he accomplished? It's all going to go to somebody. And the kicker is God then makes sure the person that God wants to get it gets it. And so basically, Solomon is saying, wise up about what life is really all about. Much to talk about. I'm going to let you guys have a break here, and please dig into Solomonic wisdom. We're going to start to close out at the end of the chapter here of chapter 8. Some of this we've covered on the slide deck. At the end of 20 years, during which time Solomon had built the two buildings, the house of Adonai and the royal palace. It took 20 years. That's a big bunch of a lifetime. King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of the Galil, that's Galilee. Recall that Hiram, the king of Tsor, had supplied, or Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress logs with all the gold Solomon wanted. Hiram came over from Tsor to see the city Solomon had given him, but he was not satisfied with them. He said, "What kinds of cities are these which you have given me, my brother?" And this statement in the Hebrew, this proclamation, or this way to say to a fellow king, my brother, is testament that we are getting a descriptor of the right time of how the correspondence in 10th century kings responded to one another. You may be the king of Hittite and you're writing to the king in Achaia, or of Ashur and you're writing to Pharaoh, and they called one another my brother, meaning equal, not my father, but my brother. And so this is very telling. One of those little gems that says we're right on cue for 10th century description of you would say diplomatic correspondence between kings. So they have been called the land of Kabul. Good for nothing till this day. I wasn't real happy with those 10 cities. Hiram had sent the king 4 tons of gold. That's a lot of gold. Following is the account of the forced labor levied by King Solomon for building the house of Adonai and his palaces. The Milo, the wall of Jerusalem, the cities of Hatzor, Megiddo, Gezer. You can also add in First Chronicles, Beersheba. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, had gone up, taken Gezer, burned it to the ground. We read all that. He gave it to Solomon. And there are the other towns that we already covered in the slide deck that Solomon built up, including the fortifications around Jerusalem, also in Lebanon. All the people still left from the Amori, the Hittite, the Pritzi, the Hivi, and the Yebusi. In other words, all the Canaanite peoples that had never quite been completely conquered, but were not part of the people of Israel, that is, their descendants remaining after them in the land, whom the people of Israel were not able to destroy completely. From them Solomon levied his forced labors, as it is to this day. But Solomon did not raise any of his forced labor from the people of Israel. Let me stop right there. When the narrative writer says, as it is to this day, we know that this account is being written down during what's called the monarchy. It is not at the time of the exile. So this is actual written down chronicles that were recorded at the kingdom time of Solomon, or it could have been the later kings of Judah. But it is as it were, or this is occurring, this forced labor as it is to this day. So I, whoever am actually writing this down by God and the Holy Spirit, am saying here, maybe in the time of Hezekiah, maybe in the time of Asa, maybe in the time of Jehoshaphat, am writing this down, telling you, I'm reflecting on Solomon, but this is how it is. And we know it's during the time of the monarchy because of little gems like this. And so all the other peoples are under subjugation, but Solomon did not raise any of his forced labor from the people of Israel. Rather, they were his soldiers, his servants, administrators, commanders, and the officials in charge of his chariots and horsemen. There were 550 chief officers over Solomon's work in charge of the works. And there's a lot of work going on, and later that will become a problem. Though the Israelites of the northern kingdom will become the northern kingdom, were not conscripted into forced labor, their land was expected to produce. And so all of the other tribes, except for Judah, had that constriction, and it will become a burr in the saddle between the 10 tribes in the north and Judah and Benjamin. Pharaoh's daughter came up from the city of David to her home, which Solomon had built for her. After that, he built again the Milo,
3 times a year, Solomon offered burnt offerings and peace offerings on the altar, which he had built for Adonai, offering incense with them on their altar before Adonai. So he finished the house. King Solomon built a fleet, here we go, of ships at Etzon Gibeah by Elat on the shore of the Sea of Suf in the land of Edom. So that's that fingerlet that comes up from the Red Sea. Today you have Aqaba on the Jordan side. You have Elat on the Israeli side. There's actually a sliver that's Egyptian. It's a big resort, beautiful place. And from there, the ships, they went to Ophir, and there they found gold, 14 tons of it. That's a lot of gold, which they brought back to King Solomon. He is wildly successful. We'll close out for today. And thank you all for participating. Please have some more discussions on what you're seeing here. And again, all the great things that God is bringing about. And thank you. We'll catch up next week.